Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's session and to the Reason Festival in general. We're in Street 5 and it's 76 and we're aiming to end exactly at 10:30. My name is Bandi Lengiti. I'm one of the organizers because we started late, I think our speakers, we're going to get that don't go through very extensive bios. I think they're all very well known. But we have Paul and Ronald, who will be taking us through the Great Land Debate from various aspects, covering to how it relates to the economy and various other issues. From my side, I would like a very lively debate, but seeing this very full room, we're very happy to see full rooms today. From my side, I'll just be fairly strict on time. So it's two things. So one, I'll be quite strict on time. When we open, Ruth will open with a 15-minute presentation. Ronald will respond for 10 minutes, and after that, I'll just take rounds of 4, I think. But I will be quite strict with sort of the contributions from the floor, just so we can allow many people to speak. So it will be 2 minutes for each contribution. So as your questions formulate, just sort of practice putting them short and clear. It's not nice to be rude to say, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. That's not what I want to do. So I'll just indicate that. The other thing is I would like as much representative discussion as possible. So just because your hand shoots up first, it's not guaranteed that you'll get to ask the question. I'm not apologetic about balancing gender, balancing sort of different viewpoints, sort of smart professors to your undergrad students. Everyone's going to have an equal opportunity to speak. So that's on that. I'd like to invite
Great. Okay. He's going to be very strict, so let me get through it. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's such an exciting, unusual conference. Not a conference, a festival. So, I was given this title, The Great Land Debate. Gilad felt we must have a big debate, so hopefully we'll have enough time to really have that debate. So before getting into this, I was asked to give a sense of what has happened with land reform up to now. So that's what I've been asked to do. But then we'll also engage with questions about the political economy and the question around constitutional amendment and what is the way forward. Now clearly, land dispossession in South Africa is a basis for structuring inequality and poverty in our society. And in many ways, if we think about, hold on, how do I go down? For some reason the down button isn't working. Fantastic. So if we think about through the 20th century, the kinds of competing visions for what would a land reformed South Africa look like? I think that actually we don't have a very clear set of ideas. The Freedom Charter said the land shall be shared among those who work it, but which land is to be shared how, by whom, where, and with what outcomes? What are we trying to achieve? In many respects, what we're trying to do is overcome agrarian dualism, the deep divides between commercial farming and communal areas in South Africa. But I think that also we need to recognize that the land question is no longer merely an agrarian question, that we live in an urbanizing society, and that a lot of politics and demand for people to have access to land is not only for agrarian livelihoods, but for access to well-located land for residential purposes as well. So, I think that it's fair to say that that we have a failed or failing land reform process that tries to do several things. So when we say the land debate, what worries me about the title is that it suggests there's one debate. The land question I also find problematic. There are many land questions. This gentleman is on the edges of the former Transkei. He and his community want access to better land, commercial farms. Here we have an emerging black commercial farmer who's actually a successful urban businessman, who is a commercial farmer alongside a white counterpart, right? So we see different dynamics, different class dynamics particularly. We also see big agribusinesses land reforming themselves through agri-BEE deals. We see farm worker equity schemes where workers become shareholders. We also see that there are communities who call commercial farms home, farm dweller communities, many of whom actually say our land question is that private commercial farms were demarcated around us. We see ourselves as having a prior right and entitlement to this land. We also see that there are communal areas around the country where people do not have clear and secure rights to the land that they occupy and use. So they're different land questions. Now, we have a property clause in the Constitution, and it does several things. I won't go into long detail because of time, but we do have a property clause that says that land may be expropriated, property may be expropriated, including in the interests of land reform. Compensation must be just and equitable, but not necessarily cash, not necessarily upfront, not necessarily market value. But there are 5 criteria: the use of the property, the history of its acquisition, the market value, the history of state investment in that property, the purpose of the expropriation. But what I think is really important is to recognize that the property clause overall is a mandate for transformation. It actually obliges the state to embark on a land redistribution to provide access to land on an equitable basis. And I would argue that, in fact, what we've seen is that the state has violated this provision of the Constitution, of Section 25(5). It also requires that there must be tenure reform, there must be restitution for those dispossessed after 1913, and importantly, there's an override clause. There's a clause that says no provision of this, including the issue of compensation, should hold the state back. And when we come back, I'm sure in question time, to debate whether or not there should be constitutional amendment, let's focus on that. How have things gone? Generally, not very well. The Restitution of Land Rights Act has provided for people to be able to lodge claims. It established a commission on the restitution of land rights and a land claims court, and over 63,000 claims were lodged. But at the current rate of settling them, what I think is a key issue is that we see that the state has been both slow and has pushed people into taking cash compensation rather than land. There's been a reopening of the land claims process, and over 160,000 new claims have now been lodged, which means that in fact at the current pace of settling land, it's going to take at least 35 years just to settle the old claims that were lodged by 1998. Potentially as much as 143 years for the new claims. We are in a totally unsustainable situation around land restitution. And I think that actually it's not the Constitution's fault, but we're going to have to find a way through to address this issue of restitution. In terms of the broader question, though, how do we redistribute access to land? What I would emphasize, and this is where we get to the political economy question, is that we've had a state that's actually been extremely conservative, both in how it goes about land reform and in whose interests. So we found that the land reform program has actually changed over time, starting from an initial period in the first 5 years, which was where in the RDP period, government was giving modest household level grants to a means-tested population to provide people with modest access to land. And broadly, one can equate these 3 phases with the Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma presidencies. Under Zuma, we saw a shift towards a more pro-commercial farmer program, where the available funds were split between fewer people, and government gave larger grants for people to get access to land. So people were getting more grants from the state, but also being asked to take out loans. And what we saw was massive repossession of farms, both by the land bank and commercial banks, as farmers were unable to pay back those loans. And starting from 2006, but from 2011 onwards, the only form of land reform has been the government going off and buying land on the open market and providing it on a leasehold basis to people, on long-term leases, or at least that's the policy, is that people should get long-term leases. But what we've found is that actually now, the priority question of in whose interests is this being done is now unclear. So if we were to compare the 3 periods, what I would say is that we see that what's been consistent is market-based purchase. which is not what the Constitution says. The Constitution does not mention willing buyer, willing seller. But the state has chosen not to use its expropriation powers within the Constitution, and instead has consistently run with market-based purchase. It's shifted away from transferring title to the state retaining ownership, and we've shifted from an explicitly pro-poor program to one which is not explicitly pro-poor. And in fact, as I'll show if I have time, we actually see substantial elite capture as groups like urban businessmen and relatively large livestock owners get priority access to land under the redistribution program. We also see that there's been a shift from providing access to land for people to do whatever they want with it, from multiple livelihoods, to a specifically commercial farming-oriented land reform program. So there's been a very significant shift that while we've been consistent on a market-based approach in terms of the class agenda of land reform, I think that there's been a significant change. Overall, around 9.7% of commercial farmland has been acquired. We think it's actually really less because a lot of people have been losing land through the market in the form of repossession. And here's the killer issue, which is that while we've had these powers to embark on a land reform program, in fact, the high point of land reform was in 2008, and there's been a very dramatic decline in the actual transfer of land since then. So in fact, we've had a dismantled land reform program under the Zuma presidency. Just to mention also that at the same time that we see a shrinking program, a more pro-elite program, it's also been a program that has not prioritized women. In fact, we estimate, and there's a problem with the Limpopo figure there, but overall around 23% of beneficiaries are women, and they're mostly in the smaller, more modest projects. The big flagship projects where a lot of money is being spent are more male-dominated. So we also see a shift in terms of gender as well as class. At the same time, we have a changing farm sector. And overall, what we've seen is a decline in the number of farming units, that's the blue line. From the middle of the 20th century downwards, we see a decline in the number of commercial farming units and a commensurate rise in the average size of commercial farming units. So in fact, what you're seeing is the opposite of a land reform process. We're seeing the consolidation of agribusiness and agrarian capital, both in primary production, but also through the entire value chain, in input industries, in processing industries, and so on. So we're presiding over an anti-land reform. At the same time, the commercial farming has been restructuring, it's been shedding labor. Here's the decline, the dark blue line, of regular workers, a process of a proportionate casualization of employment, but we've seen a shrinkage of agrarian and agricultural employment in the commercial farming sector. And while we have important laws that are meant to provide security to people who live on farms, not only who work, but who live on farms, neither of these laws, the Extension of Security of Tenure Act and the Land Reform Labour Tenants Act, they don't stop evictions, but they're meant to regulate when and how they happen, and they provide for long-term tenure, but they've been incredibly badly implemented. And as the famous Nkuzi survey showed us, it's the only attempt to provide a national picture of evictions and displacement from farms. What we see is that in the first 10 years of democracy, around 2.3 million people are estimated to have been displaced from farms, of whom nearly 1 million were actually forcibly evicted. That is more than in the last 10 years of apartheid. So the pace of the forced removal of black people from land has been gathering pace under democracy, despite our land reform program. What's also important to note here is that the number of people losing access to land through forced farm evictions is greater than the number of people gaining access to land through the land reform process. So in fact, in terms of racial inequality in access to land removing, it seems that we're moving backwards. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Finally, let's recognize that there is the issue of communal tenure. This is another land question. This very interesting map shows, it's a South African Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a project by SASPRI, it's a partnership between South Africans and the University of Oxford. And they take multiple factors to look at what a relative deprivation, people's access to formal dwellings, running water, electricity, education, and so on. Now, these dark blue areas are the most deprived areas of the country, and we can see that they're pretty much mapped perfectly onto the boundaries of the old Bantustans, which shows that actually our structures, the economic structures of inequality, are pretty much intact. And these are areas that are home to about 30% of the population. So a very significant proportion of our population are living in communal areas. They are among the most deprived South Africans, and they do not have legally secure tenure rights. And while there's an interim act that is meant to provide some kind of base of protection against dispossession, in fact we find in many parts of the country, particularly where there are valuable resources like mineral resources, that there's been dispossession of people from their customary land to make way for mining ventures, commercial farming, etc. A lot of these have been corrupt, questionable, and there are disputes often between communities and traditional authorities over royalties and income from the transaction of customary land. One of the most controversial issues is, of course, the Ingonyama Trust, where in fact what the government did in 1994, just before elections, is transfer private ownership to the Ingonyama Trust of the whole of the KwaZulu Bantustan. And now the king, who's the only trustee, has been presiding over a process where there's been a conversion of customary ownership into leaseholds. So people are actually having to sign leases to continue to occupy their own customary land and to pay rent. So these are some of the controversial issues. So that's why I say that there is not one land question, there are many. The budget for land reform has been volatile, but generally on the decline since 2008. And I just want to, as I wrap up, I want to talk about what I think. In the discussion time, we can discuss and debate whether amending the Constitution is going to help us or how it can help us to address any of these issues. But for now, what I want to suggest is that there are important questions that we need to think about in terms of alternative policy approaches, right? What are the 7 big questions that we need to be asking ourselves? To my mind, the very first question is a class question, a class and gender question. The question is, who is it for? Who should land reform be prioritizing? Should there, for instance, be priority for landless and land poor farmers, farm workers, the peri-urban landless? In other words, not for commercial farmers and not for urban businessmen. What could land reform look like? Should we, for instance, be subdividing big commercial farms instead of replicating the same big farm model? The capital-intensive, industrially driven commercial farming model. So perhaps instead of trying to preserve the existing structure, we should use land reform as an opportunity to break up large holdings and to challenge this trend. Where should we be focusing? In other words, maybe we should strategically prioritize certain parts of the country, areas where there is high demand, including peri-urban land, where we know that there's significant need. In other words, instead of relying on land that is offered in the market, maybe we should be proactively identifying, now that we know who wants land, what they want it for, to actually proactively target and identify that. With what tenure? Should people be getting title or not? This is a key debate. Regardless of how you get the land, if you expropriate, what we're seeing is that people are not getting land for free. They're in fact they're getting land on leasehold and having to pay rent either to the state or to traditional authority. So we need to ask what tenure system we want. How should we decide the process? Can we imagine a land reform process that involves local participatory democratic processes where people identify and negotiate what land they're wanting? So once we've identified who it's for, what land, where, and for what purposes, then I think we can address the question of how to get the land. Expropriation, negotiation, maybe also purchase on the open market. My view is that actually we need to be thinking about a combination of methods of acquisition. Expropriation is important as a mechanism to break deadlock. For instance, where land claimants are claiming back land, but the current owners are not willing to part with that land on the terms that the state offers. Expropriation is a crucial mechanism to break deadlock. But that is a separate question from whether or not to compensate. And my view is that what we're moving towards through the constitutional review process, and I'm sure Ronald will add on this, is that there needs to be clarity in law and in policy that compensation will be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So it's not like there should be no compensation in every single case. That would not be just or equitable. but that there should be a spectrum, a compensation spectrum, ranging from, in some cases, 0 to partial to market-related. And I'm going to make an argument, which is that actually an affirmative action principle would suggest that some cases should be compensated above market level. For instance, a lot of the people, the majority of people who are being evicted from land in South Africa are black and poor. So we need to have a compensation regime that has that spectrum and clarifies when and how we're going to approach the compensation issue. So let me leave it at that. And Ronald, I'm sure you'll pick up on the constitutional question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone, and Prof. Ruth and Mandile. I think I'm not going to do the things that are done by professors. I'm putting a slide there. I'll just speak from here. I will also not go into a detailed presentation. I think she has given a sketch of the land question in the country. What I can just do is to give you a perspective from the ANC policy, its evolution on the land question, and hopefully that will answer some of the issues that when Ruth was presenting, was also feeling like the government was on trial. The ANC was formed in 1912 in direct response to the disposition of the African indigenous majority of this country. And this response, this process of disposition of the African majority was formally promulgated into legislations when the Glen Grey Act was introduced by Cecil John Rhodes, which its aim was to ensure that there is a black labor force that is forced to go into the mining areas, because South Africa had just discovered diamond, and in some areas there was also some discovery of gold. So the mining sector and the industrialization of the country needed labor, and the labor meant that it cannot only be just labor, it also had to be cheap labor. And this is what Cecil John Rhodes said when he introduced the Glen Grey Act, which was an argument for the hard tax to obtain the cheap labor for the mines and the industrialization of the country. You will remove the natives from the life of sloth and laziness. You will teach them the dignity of labor and make them contribute to the prosperity of the state and give them some good return for a wise and good governance. The provisions of the Glen Grey Act was therefore incorporated into the 1913 Land Act. The 1913 Land Act then extended beyond just to put a hard tax for the majority of black people across the country. It also specifically categorized which land and how it must only go to whites and which one must go to black people. And 87% of the land was reserved solely for white people and 13% for the black population. And various laws were also introduced, the Group Areas Act and many others that dealt with the black spots to ensure that there's no black person living in arable or productive land. Therefore, the ANC, since it was formed, it was aimed to respond to this question of the dispossession of the majority of the blacks, and also to redress these imbalances so that the majority of the population can participate. And in this regard, the ANC drafted the 1923 ANC Bill of Rights, 1943 African Claims, the Freedom Charter, which I suspect is well known in this house, and the 1991 Constitutional Guidelines. So this evolution, the ANC from its formation was about redistribution of the land, including the Freedom Charter, which speaks about the land being shared among those who work it. I think this answers Ruth's question. Who must the land be shared? The ANC has always believed, even during the time of the Freedom Charter, that it must be shared among those who work the land. So what did the ANC do since 1994? I think Ruth has traversed the road. What I mean is that the land reform program has indeed failed. But the reasons it has failed in our country is one, as you have seen from the background, is that we had envisaged that we were going to do a redistribution process. But we were advised by the World Bank that we need to do a restitution process. And somewhere we ended up with the restitution process, more emphasis on the restitution process rather than the redistribution process. What the restitution process did, it delayed any process of a land claim, because one claim can take 5 to 10 years. You need historians, you need evidence, you must go to court, the land claims court. By the time the land claims court decides, it's about 5 or 10 years. And this is where we made an error of judgment as the ANC. So we should have from the beginning went for the redistribution, which is less time consuming, but it's also specific. You purchase, you redistribute to those that need it to work it. And because of that, we are now living with a population now, almost the biggest land need in the country is no longer what we had in 1994 for farming and so forth. It is now an urban demand. The land need has now changed. 60% of the population, because farming was closed for a few in the population, the white old males. It meant that the majority of those that are in rural areas can't have access to work, they can't be employed in the farms, also they cannot run their own farms. So the population was forced to now move into urban areas. To move in terms of the global, the United Nations has been said that almost 60% of the global population is now shifting into the cities. But China has been able to buck that trend. 51% of the Chinese population lives in urban areas, 49% of the Chinese population live in rural areas. It's because China was able to do an effective land redistribution process. Even countries like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, they were able to use land reform to unlock economic participation by the majority of the population, but also for the population to participate in the mainstream of the economy. So it therefore means in our country, the land question, as Ruth was saying, is not only a class question, it's also a racial issue. And I think the land hearings have reflected that. You know, you will have seen the majority of those who attended the hearings across the country in terms of the oral presentation were black in their majority. Those that made written submissions in their majority is white. So it also reflects the literacy and the illiteracy level of the country. But then what is the solution? Our view is that we need to move to put redistribution laws that will ensure and emphasize on a need basis redistribution of land to the youth, women, farm workers and farm dwellers, the urban, peri-urban poor, and those that really need the land. And how can we do that as quickly as possible? One of the discussions that we had is that we need to put an expropriation law. Some of you who might be following the discussion, you know that Parliament has withdrawn the expropriation bill. It's going to be reintroduced with clear categories of which land and under which circumstances will the land be expropriated without compensation. But there will be circumstances where there will be compensation for the expropriation of land, and the expropriation bill will therefore define which circumstances we will not compensate. And the second thing will be the drafting of the redistribution bill. For us, the issue of the amendment of the Constitution is just to make it explicitly clear. Because in reality, while there was also failure from our side in government in terms of land reform, there was also resistance from white landowners. So if the Constitution is not clear, it will still be contested. It might still take years to run land reform because white landowners are not only capacitated in terms of resources, but also they have got the good skills that they are able to frustrate the process of land reform. So the country needs both white and black to come together to agree on a clear program of land reform which can enable us to move smoothly, and that's why the ANC has been in discussion with Africa SA and many other landowners in the country to make this process possible and to make it practical, because it is in the interest of all of us to have political and economic stability. And without the cooperation of all South Africans, we will not be able to produce a non-racial society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronald. So we can head straight into the questions, but I will remind people of my ground rules.
Alright, greetings everyone. First of all, I'd just like to sort of talk about a bit of statistics. Last time I checked, there was an unemployment rate of 52% amongst black people and 1% of white people. Now, how do you address unemployment, and how there's the principle of willing buyer and willing seller? I think from that, I just have a question with regards to that, as to 52% of black people are unemployed, and how do you willingly buy from a person who is from a group that is 1% unemployed? Another point I'd like to make is how in the country we have white graduates who actually, we don't know how many sit at home and whether they do inherit wealth from home, whereas from youth unemployment from a black perspective is black tax. Just on those 2 points, I'd like to ask, how do we then redistribute land to people who are actually in a, I wouldn't say oppressed state, but in a less privileged way? So to end off with a quote, so that my question can be answered, is that people who view equality from a privileged perspective, once you talk to them about equality, it feels like oppression. Thank you.
Hi everybody. I just want to thank the panelists quickly, and I just have a question for Ruth. I just want to ask about her suggestion for a compensation spectrum. I just have this worry that if you withhold this idea of compensation, won't that still slow down the process? How can we ensure that there's no vested interests still being held and maintained, and that there's no corruption and white monopoly capital still being benefited? I just think perhaps a more radical approach of no compensation will do the work more effectively, even at the expense of chaos. That's all.
So, what's the brother, the back bench with this? Yeah, you can start and then move up.
Oh, thank you, Chairperson. Maybe I'm finding a bit of a challenge with what is being said here. Because if you look at the likes of Chris Hani, when he left the CODESA talk, remember the issue was that there was a compromise on the issue of the land. And secondly, South Africa is using a Roman Dutch law. And when you look at South Africa, the Africans by nature, they had their own customary laws. And of which is our own customary law is not being recognized as much as we recognize a Roman Dutch law. And we know that the Roman Dutch law will never favor us as Africans. So now my question to my leader there, Ronald, I'd like to find out, are we going to see this, the Section 25 of the Constitution being amended before the 2019 elections?
Thank you. Okay, my name is Kaya Kobo. Thank you very much, firstly, Professor Ruth, I think we are meeting for the second or the third time now, and we are meeting for the same topic.
And we try to condemn you in the past meetings we had about how your report and your input is so historical. In terms of it does not even try to outline the historical injustices that occurred in the past that ensure that our people are dispossessed of land, and how that ensure that our people currently they have nothing, they are living in poverty, they are living in slums, they have nothing to show that they are really human beings and they have dignity and they are human. So I think now, Professor Ruth, it's safe to declare that you are very problematic in a way. It's become a problem. But I'm not going to start there, I'm not going to even engage that input as well. Comrade Ronald, I believe that you are serving in that land commission of the ANC. And knowing that you have already outlined that there was a 1913 Land Act, that I believe fundamentally was a direct response to the formation of the ANC. And the ANC in its formation was to address the issue of land distribution because of the fighting for land. Okay, I will sum up. And now that the ANC took it more than 7 or 8 years to come with a policy that was going to react to the 1913 Land Act that was reacting to its formation. Moving forward, leadership, just to sum up, because I don't have too much time. Knowing that there's this reluctance from the landowners, which is the minority currently, which are predominantly white, and our people are coming to are very unwilling. I'm going to some of regional leadership, so please don't disturb. I'm going to some of very quickly now. And knowing that our people now they are becoming unwilling they are becoming impatient. I just want to ask you one thing. Do you really think that now, if really white people are refusing to give back the land to the rightful owners, do you think that black people will be able to go to a civil war? Do you think they are ready as a black people? Because if that might
Thank you. I will try to answer some of the questions. I think maybe let me start. I may not be able to answer all of them, but I will try. I will attempt to get the ones. Maybe let me start where we ended with the civil war. The reality is that the country is at crossroads. There's a cul-de-sac which all of us can only be able to go through it in a constitutional and a discussion that is honest from all South Africans in terms of what can resolve the economic injustice that was perpetuated by apartheid. And the land question, the land is a means of through which people are able to participate in the means of, or in the mainstream of the economy. And that's how the ANC has always viewed this discussion. And it is because of that that the ANC participates and is able to mediate in society for us to go through this constitutional process, and that this process must be the one that takes us through the land debate. I mean, if we wanted it differently, we could have, I mean, we are in government already, but we can't go through it in a violent way. I mean, countries like Mozambique and China, it was a violent takeover by the proletariat in China. And even in Mozambique, it was a violent takeover by Samora Machel and his forces. In South Africa, it was a negotiated settlement. There were some discussions, and at the end, the discussions produced what we had, what was called an interim constitution. And the compromise was in the interim constitution. I always get a sense that people think that even with the final constitution, there was a compromise. With the final constitution, there was no longer a compromise. That's why it was called in the interim constitution the sunset clauses. The sunset when the final constitution of 1996 was adopted. So the section 25 of the constitution is not a compromise. It's a product of a constitutional process in Parliament. It's not a product of CODESA. The final constitution was adopted by Parliament, and it was a discussion by Parliament. And that's why when you read section 25, you'll see that in reality it's an enabler. It's not a clause that protects property rights. It's a clause that from section 25.1 up until section 25.8 speaks about how government can take the land. So it enables us, it says in section 25.3 how we can take it and affect us. It also speaks about us producing legislations to expropriate land and so forth. The challenge which I said earlier was that when we came into force, we only focused on the restitution part, which was a product also of section 25, without going to section 25.5 of going to the redistribution clause, which will have enabled us to do land reform quicker and with a fast pace. With regard to the willing buyer, willing seller, I think it's also the same. The willing buyer, willing seller is also not part of our constitution. It's not in the constitution. If you go through section 25, there's no willing buyer, willing seller. Maybe this issue of the principle of willing buyer, willing seller came from the 1975 Expropriation Act, but the Expropriation Act of 1975 speaks about market value and the willing buyer and the willing seller. Maybe that's where it came from, but if you look into all the laws that we have today, we don't have this principle. But the reality is that we will not be able to achieve we will not be able to achieve a rainbow nation without economic equality or economic justice. So whites and blacks in this country have to find each other in this regard. And in the reality, the majority of white people who are the owners of the means of production and the economy needs to come into the party and be able to understand that everyone needs to participate. Because when you look at their posture, some of them, I mean, the strike in Sasol by solidarity, and some of the presentation in the constitutional review process, is there's a clear resistance and unwillingness to help the country to achieve economic equality. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the comments and questions. And I actually hope that we're going to have another round, because I think that there's something that we're not actually addressing here. There's a silence, which is about what is our vision for an economic alternative in the countryside? What is the alternative to this large-scale commercial farming model that we've inherited and that has actually become more and more entrenched? It is a labor-shedding sector, right? It is not, as the National Development Plan would have us believe, a sector that is going to provide 1 million new jobs. We're going to have to think of something different, right? We cannot just carry on with the path dependency we have. So yes, okay, I will respond to particular questions. Apparently I'm ahistorical. I didn't think I was. I took dispossession as a given, and I said, this is the basis of poverty and inequality that is racialized and spatially distributed in this country. But also, it's not only a historical legacy, it is a continuing reality, which is dispossession is continuing, right? And we're actually seeing growing inequalities in both rural and urban areas. So I think that particularly the mass expulsion of farm dwellers is a huge problem. And this is where it sounds like in many respects Ronald and I agree, but in fact the one area that I would challenge you is this question of the Freedom Charter, that I don't think that it's clear that land reform is favoring those who work the land. In fact, I've done a lot of field-based research where I find that there are farm workers who are overlooked. There's small-scale farmers from the communal areas who are overlooked. And then who gets commercial farmers? What we hear from, well, what I've found in my own research and what also we heard from the high-level panel report, that report commissioned by Parliament and in the panel chaired by former President Motlanthe, is that the key problems have been elite capture. There's been mismanagement, there's been corruption, there have been low budgets, so there are a whole lot of challenges that we face. Why are we not subdividing farms? Why are we not making available small holdings that are suited to the real needs of people? So I would agree with you, Ronald, that in many respects what happened in 1995-96 when we had the final constitution, the ANC got what it wanted, and what it wanted was a property clause that mandated land reform on the one hand and empowered the state to expropriate in the interests of land reform. And it has chosen not to use those powers consistently. In fact, when the Mala Mala case, the big game farm, came up, the state actually withdrew the case from the constitutional court. So the Con Court has never had an opportunity to rule on what is just and equitable compensation. Instead, the state chose to pay out nearly R1 billion to one white family, rather than have a test case that would show what is just and equitable compensation. So I think that we need to get real about the politics of this. Firstly, we see a growing concentration of corporate ownership in agriculture, where those who own the farms are not just the individual white family farmers who were set up in the 1940s and 50s and supported by the apartheid government. Increasingly, we see corporate power penetrating into agriculture. And this is corporate power that is financialized. This is pension funds. These are international funds. These are hedge funds. So what I found very striking is when this question about amending the constitution arose, who were the first people on the phone saying, oh my goodness, what is going to happen? It wasn't the farmers, it was the banks. Yes. They're really worried, right? And they want to know what's going to happen. So let's be clear that the ANC could have embarked on expropriation without compensation under the just and equitable clause of the Constitution, but has chosen not to do so. So I think that we need to now start to think about the politics. I think what is going to happen, if I can get back to this, no, it's gone. Anyway, there are a few different possibilities. The one is state custodianship of land, and this is the EFF position. It is not ANC policy, and therefore I do not think it's going to happen. It doesn't technically require changing the Constitution. Custodianship of water and of minerals has already happened under Section 25, okay, of the Constitution. But I think that the real spectrum of possibility that we're in now is that the ANC is being forced for the first time to take the land issue much more seriously. It's being pushed partly from the emergence of the EFF. It's being pushed partly by the growth of urban demand for land. And so I think that we will see this land issue becoming much more central to our politics. But the question that I would ask is, what would a successfully land-reformed South Africa look like? How would our cities look different? How would our countryside look different? And my hope and my vision is that instead of trying to simply replicate the same models, that we start to think of alternatives. And that must mean driving a clear class agenda, thinking about different production models. What are the alternatives to large-scale industrial agriculture? Can small holdings work? If so, who should be targeted? How do we change the value chains so that people can benefit? So I think that we need to be opening up this vision, up the debate around alternatives. What do the alternatives look like? And it's inadequate to only focus on the question of how to get the land. We have to be able to answer the questions of in whose interests? Who? What is the class agenda? How is agriculture going to look different as a result? So that is my challenge, and I know that there are a few people in the audience who are dying to say something, so I will shut up right now. Thanks.
Oh, second round. Okay. Front from the polka dot. Yeah, we're in the second round, that's 3. Cool, thank you.
Okay, my question is for, I forgot the gentleman's name from the ANC. Okay, I think the land issue has been, there's so much emphasis on the commercialization of land, and I think to an extent we have neglected the other aspect that the protesters have not been, mostly everyone in the process has not been, I want to be a farmer. Other people just want to build houses, especially people in the urban areas. So what is being done to help those kind of people? Because there's vacant land, they will occupy that land, but some of them cannot build proper houses like using bricks because it's not your land, although the land it is vacant. And also if you look at the former homelands, there's beautiful land there that is available. So you can still get some land through the traditional bodies like Osborne,
but you don't know, like you don't have the resources to work that land. For instance, in terms of climate change, it's not raining anymore, irrigation systems are needed. So are you not, like my question is, are you not neglecting the other aspect, like people living in the urban areas and people living in the rural areas, they have some land, but they're not profiting from that land? Thank you.
My question is based on the distribution of power. Yeah, it's based on the distribution of power. I'll just start with a quote from Acton. I don't know exactly, I don't recall it exactly. It goes like, the distribution of power results in despotism and its concentration. Now my question is to the lady there, is what are other alternatives to making sure that the power doesn't rest solely to the state when it comes to the distribution of the land?
30 seconds, you're 3 pages.
Who's next? Can you pass it down?
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just wondering, I'm hearing a lot of very interesting things, and this is a very interesting topic, but practically, South Africa just went through a massive water crisis, and a lot of these land issues are about farms. I grew up in the countryside, and I remember you had people there who spent generations on the same farm, and they had information and knowledge that can't just be replicated. So my question is, if land distribution does happen, and it is equally distributed, how are we going to ensure that the knowledge and information is equally distributed so that we can, keep on farming and looking after our people? Because ultimately it's about South Africans, and we need to eat. I think the water crisis showed us all that, Africa is a volatile country. We have to look after ourselves, and that information that has been gathered through hundreds of years and generations of farming, how are we going to pass that knowledge on? Is something being put in place for that? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. There's been growing talks about that agriculture is the growth narrative to economic prosperity. Now, I want to know that should the land redistribution be successful, will it really get us to that point where we unlock that economic potential of agriculture in South Africa? Thank you.
Very positive. We don't have a question to start. Ruth or Ron?
Okay, thank you. I think the first question relates to the commercialization of the land, the former homelands, whether we're not neglecting the people who want places of residence. And that's why, from the beginning, I said the biggest need is now for human settlement, 60% of the population. So we are also considering that. But this must also obviously go with spatial planning, because with the land question in the country, it's not only the distribution of the land, but it was also, we're also grappling with the apartheid spatial planning that took black people away from places of work and made white people reside next to where they work. In other countries in the world, like Austria and other countries, they ensure that those that don't have money for traveling and so forth stays next to where they work. They can walk to work, they can ride bicycles. But in our country, the poor ironically stays far, far, far away from where they work. In fact, I suspect even students is the same kind of a situation where those that have resources stays next to the campus, and those that do not have resources stays in Soweto, Alexandra, and many other places. So this land question for us is also meant to address this apartheid spatial planning, and that's why now we're also reviewing the powers of the national government to be able to intervene, also not only for residents, but also for economic issues across the country. So that if a person wants to invest in any kind of economy, he knows if you want to do tourism, you know which province you must be able to go to, and if you want to do agriculture, there were provinces that were well known for agriculture in this country, like the Free State and so forth. So there's that kind of a discussion. With regard to the distribution power of the state, I think the high-level panel spoke about the corruption in the process and so forth. And that's why one of the things we're considering is to look into some kind of committees where communities will be involved in the allocation of the land and also make it more transparent, so that it's not only a politician who decide which land must go to who. There must some kind of a safeguard and also some kind of a transparency that will enable this process to be as easy as possible. With regard to the custodianship and the wholesale nationalization of the land, we have had a discussion and looked at it ourselves. And we looked at the Minerals and Petroleum Act, which custodianship under the state, including the Water Act, which says all South Africans own the water, they own the minerals. So it's an experienced government for the past 5-10 years that we have. And we said, do South Africans really own the minerals? Does that law really means they own it? It's just a cosmetic academic thing that they have. So if we do the same with the land, we might end up with the same results. You will all be declared to be owners of the land, but you cannot walk into the land and claim access and use it. It's just going to be academic, and that's why we felt that, and that's why we disagreed with the EFF on this one. And ourselves were very clear that we must be able to use expropriation laws, expropriate the land, and give it to a person or a community. And when we give, we mean giving you a title deed to that land. Not that the custodianship, or you must lease it from the state. We give you a title deed. That is our position, because we don't want to do an academic exercise. With regard to communal land, we are doing a study, but there are two preliminary findings which we are coming into, and this also come into some discussions. That one, we have got an option of giving title to all communal land in the country, rural people. What will that do? It will immediately commercialize rural land. The first unintended consequence will be the people who are now accessing land for 1 rand or 100 rand or 50 rand may no longer afford it because it will be commercial. Two is that those people might also put it in the market, sell it 5 or 10 years, they will be coming back to us as government and saying, I no longer have land. And if you look at it today, the communal land in the former Bantustan is the most secured place for black people to have land. They are sure, even if a person stays anywhere, he knows that his mother's house will never be expropriated or be taken by the bank. So that's why we're doing a study, so that we don't end up with unintended consequences. The other option which we looked at is to maybe give, to ensure that the PTO can be registered, which already they have. How can we make sure that the PTO is registered and it cannot be sold? Or if it's sold, there must be some means that it must revolve within the family. Because if we also allow it to be a tradable commercial instrument, it will have the other unintended consequence. So these are the discussions that we're having, and hopefully the study will at the end guide us how we must address and ensure that there's security of tenure in communal land, because we are also concerned chiefs are evicting people out of nowhere. You have seen the report on the Ngwenyama Trust. But with regard to that, the portfolio committee has already spoken to Ngwenyama Trust to stop issuing lease and so forth. So we're looking into the issue, how do we ensure that there's security of tenure on communal land, which is a process that we're undergoing.
No, I think that we're a bit stuck in terms of how we think about land rights in South Africa. People who are land claimants, who are claiming back land that they were dispossessed of through restitution, get private title. Under redistribution, there is no provision of title. Now, government is trying to give people title in the cities under the Urban Rapid Land Release Program. But now people in the communal areas are not to get title. And I think that what we're doing is we're replicating the dualisms. We're saying certain different kinds of rights for different people in different categories of land. And this is deeply problematic. What is the way forward? I think that the most exciting proposal by the high-level panel last year was actually not about expropriation or anything else. It was about a land records bill. And it's quite a potentially radical idea, which is that everybody, no matter where we occupy land, we should have a right to make some kind of record of the land that we occupy and use openly. That everyone should be able to do that. That's not the same as a private title deed, but that over time people can record their rights. The vast majority of South Africans, over 60% of South Africans, have no registered rights to the land that they occupy and use. And transferring one by one the title to an RDP house is going to go so slowly. The vast majority of people are not benefiting. Most important thing is that we democratize this process. There's a whole lot of experience internationally where people are using blockchain technology and all kinds of things, using GPSs and documenting and securing their rights. I think we need to get much more creative. But the reality is that none of this is really going to happen unless there is push and pressure from below. So one question I think somebody raised, which is, it was the gentleman at the back. Let's think about the distribution of power. The alternatives should not only be about the state, not only about the state's power to acquire and expropriate land. What about citizens' power to hold the state to account and to ensure that there is some form of transparency? And I'm glad to hear Ronald now talking about this, because there is this idea that we should have an expropriation act that clarifies the state's powers, but we should also have a redistribution act that says that people are entitled to access to land on an equitable basis, and it should be an enforceable right. The state should be accountable for why it allocates resources in the way that it does. So remember the Vrede farm in the Free State, right? This is not an isolated case. There are many cases where 10, 20, 30 million rand was spent of public money to buy an individual farm. Why do we not ask the state to be accountable for how it distributes its scarce resources on the land question? We need to be asking those questions. And what about people at a local level being able to say, we think that we should take priority because our needs are most urgent? So actually there's an area of law that needs to be explored, which is what is access to land on an equitable basis? What is a right to land redistribution? What does that right look like? How can people exercise that right? So I think that that's very important. The question about practically how can knowledge be redistributed, let's be very clear. The majority of farmers in South Africa are black, right? Mm-hmm. There are around 5,000 fully commercial black farmers. There are around 250,000 black farming households who are farming at least partly for some income, but partly for subsistence. And there are over 2 million black farming households who farm to supplement their access to food. The vast majority of farming households in South Africa are black. People have knowledge. In fact, then we also have 2.8 million black farm workers in South Africa. There are around 30,000 commercial farming units that are owned either by white South Africans or by black South Africans or by corporates. Right? So we have a very small sector of the agricultural economy that are small in number but dominating. So I think that there is enormous push, particularly from the communal areas where people have knowledge and experience of farming but have inadequate access and support for land. And here I would like to ask, I don't know if anyone here wants to add specifically on the question of what do the alternatives look like. I don't know if I can be very rude, and ask if Mazibuko doesn't want to suggest some answers to us, because he was waving his hand, and I know that he's involved with some experiments of alternatives. So let's not only think that our alternatives are sitting within white commercial agriculture or the communal areas. We can create new possibilities. Thank you.
Okay, cool. A final round. I'll take Mazibuko because it's been suggested. That's alright. Down here and then yep. Oh no, sorry. Down.
Ruth, I don't have time to talk about other options. I want to go to something else in the discussion. Both you and Ronald have posed the urban land as a major need, which is true. But there's a danger in posing it the way you have. It's similar to what the ANC did in Parliament when it amended the EFF resolution to put food security as a scarecrow in ways that actually can limit imagination about radical land reform, which we need. So as much as the land question is, the urban land question is important, but it should not be used in ways that block off the need for redistribution and appropriation. I'm not saying you're saying that, but there's a danger, given how the ANC is quite capable of squaring round circles. When it comes to the constitutional issues, what I think is absent in the discussion is the role of the judiciary. 25(2)(b) forces most of the decisions about redistribution and distribution to a court decision. And what that does is the implicit protection of unjust property rights, and that case-by-case basis you're arguing for, Ruth, is quite a long route, given that there's 86 million hectares of land to redistribute. And for example, we could be creating institutions like the public protector in the Constitution, relevant for land redistribution. Finally, to expropriate in the manner that Ronald proposes takes away the notion of land as a public good. And this is quite important, because actually what we may end up having is the state using its power to expropriate, but actually handing over land for privatization, which actually can lead to major inequalities. That's quite key. I'm sorry, I wanted to say more, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. You stole them, sir. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mandile. So Gavin Capps from the Mining and Rural Transformation Project at BITS. So 2 questions, both to Ronald Lamola. So Ronald, you reminded us that when the ANC was formed in 1912, the land question was very much at the heart of its formation. One of the key constituencies in its formation in 1912 was the chiefs. And I'd like to hear from you directly, who now should own the land in the communal areas and control the land in the communal areas of post-apartheid South Africa? Should it be the chiefs, or should it be the people who live and who work on it? So a straight answer to that question, please. The second is to do with your history of recent policy adoption by the ANC and what you said about redistribution and restitution and the prioritisation of restitution. I was surprised to hear that. First of all, I was surprised to hear that you said it was because you took the advice of the World Bank. One would assume that if the ANC had been dealing with the land policy since 1912, it would have come to power with its own land policy and wouldn't have needed the advice of the World Bank. But also as well, the advice of the World Bank wasn't the only advice on offer, yet it was the World Bank's advice that the ANC chose to follow. What it didn't choose to follow was prioritising restitution over redistribution. The push for restitution actually came largely from the land NGOs who had been fighting forced removals in the 70s and 80s. It didn't come from the World Bank. What you took from the World Bank was the willing buyer, willing selling model, and its market, which has been at the centre of your redistribution mechanism. So the question is, to what extent will the market remain at the centre of your redistribution policy in the light of the current policy review which is being undertaken? Because it's clearly a policy has failed, and as you said, that's what you took from the World Bank.
And then I think because of the good behavior of previous contributors, we can take Charles from the Messiah and the red cap.
Hi, I just have a question for Ruth. I wanted to know, with regards to a recent judgment, I think it's called Mise versus the Director of Rural Land Reform, where Tembeka rules down, where he challenges Section 23 of the Constitution. I'd just like to know what happens when this judgment, because it still needs to be challenged at Concord, what is the impact of that judgment for land reform in South Africa?
Hello. My question is to Ronald. You, in your presentation, I did step out for a bit, sorry. You did mention China quite often, I think. And my question is, I I hope to God you're not looking at them to like, you're not using any of their policies, because even though China has been able to nationalize quite a lot of things like land, it all came at a very, very big cost. And that cost was freedom and human rights, as well as there were specific conditions that set up for that being successful, and that was communism. And my parents grew up in communist China, and there are never any good stories about that. So I hope when you're doing your policies, and there's also a question, I hope you're not looking at China as like a golden child or something like that.
Okay, my name is Rabela from
Sorry,
the Food Sovereignty Campaign.
The market, starting with my thank you.
From the Food Sovereignty Campaign. So we've indulged in many alternatives trying to acquire land. So we've been through the land reform program, but it's been slow. So we've tried to introduce agroecology as one of our practices that we have, and it has worked, but the government is not supporting that. So we've tried to do occupation of taking land for peasants and farm workers, and then they've been successful, but the government is not supporting us in that also. So, but I'm trying to understand and ask the comrade from the ANC, if you if you have not been like assisting us in terms of like occupation, how will you make sure that peasants and farm workers get access to land through the process of land expropriation and farm compensation? Because my problem is this: it comes from the top, it doesn't come from the bottom. How will we make sure that the people get access to land? Just because the program of the land reform, from my understanding, it has excluded a lot of people that are practicing like agroecology and food sovereignty. So how will you make sure that the people from the ground get access to land?
Thank you very much. That leaves us exactly 10 minutes until 10:30. So I think it's sort of 5 minutes each, maybe with a final wrap up and your final thoughts from each speaker.
I think from my comrade Jara, I think you read our mind with regard to when we amend the constitution, maybe we might need to put an institution almost like the public protector. So that is the route we're taking. And from here, I've got a consultation with Tembega, and that is what we're going to do. So you have read our mind. It's already something that we've discussed, and I think I agree with you on that one. Then on the redistribution that we might end up privatizing, I think we are in a, as well, you can see we're considering various options. So we can still look at what you can still send us something in writing, but what we are also obviously have to do is to ensure that people who get the land, because it's particularly in relations to farming in the rural areas or anywhere where they want to farm, we need to put a mechanism of them being able to also have access to finance, because the biggest challenge which we have had in the last years of dealing with farm redistribution or restitution is the fact that majority of the black farmers cannot be commercialized because they can't get access to finance. So whatever instrument must be able to be linked to the financial sector or for them to be able to access finance, because the state, while it gives support, it is not enough. They also have to look at it in the market. The role of the judiciary, I think on that one there was, you will remember the expropriation bill of 2008. We tried to jingle it and remove the role of the judiciary there. And it was withdrawn at some point. It was heavily challenged. They said it's unconstitutional and all kinds of things. So we had to redraft the expropriation bill in 2015. Again, we have withdrawn it now to incorporate the principle of expropriation without compensation. What we are toying with is when does the judiciary come in? Must the executive make a decision to expropriate the farm and take the farm or the land, and then the judiciary can come in to debate whether the compensation was fair or not fair? or whether the expropriation, but at the time when the judiciary come in, the land must have been taken, that kind of a situation. So that's what we're looking at, because unfortunately the Constitution says any dispute must be adjudicated by the judiciary. So there's no way we can remove the judiciary altogether, but we can just play around and see whether we cannot have a situation where by the time the judiciary come into place, it does not stop the process of, it's already done. The debate is whether it was fair or whether the compensation was just and equitable. The chiefs under communal land, who owns the land, it must be the people.
Yeah.
It will come to the NGOs, willing buyer, willing seller, and so forth. With regard to the chiefs, who are not ambiguous, who are clear that it must be the people. The only issue that is being discussed is what then becomes the role of the chiefs. Because already they are there, they are playing some role of administering the land and so forth. But then even now, it must be administered on behalf of the people. So it's not like the land is owned by the chiefs. Neither do we have an intention to give the land to the chiefs ourselves. We do not have. We are clear that it must be by the people. And the process, that's where we need to maybe democratize it. Because the high-level panel spoke about the abuse of power by the chiefs. It's well documented. It's something that we know, including the Ngwenyama Trust. The portfolio committee had to intervene because there was an abuse of power by the king when he introduced the lease and so forth. So we might need to jingle also that process to ensure that the people's power is felt in the administering of the land. China, more often. No, I think from the high-level panel report, it's clear that South Africa has got enough examples and enough experience to review its own land policy. And that's why in my reference, I went through the failures and the successes of our own land policy, including the advice by the World Bank, which is being disputed. But that is what we were advised, that in that process it will be faster and it will be more expeditious. But it's clear it did not happen. So I'm looking at our own experiences. But obviously you can refer to other, we also refer to other countries. I refer to South Korea, to Japan, Taiwan. You cannot deal with any national question without some kind of reference to other jurisdiction where the processes was tested. And in fact, when it comes to China, indeed it came at a high cost. We are also aware. But that high cost is also a good experience for us to learn that if you do it like this, it means these are the costs that you're going to deal with. These are the costs and the consequences of this kind of a policy. So we looked into it. But we also have observed, I think in 2004, for the first time China introduced in its constitution a property rights clause. I know in this country they always refer to China that land in China is state-owned and so forth. But for the first time in 2004, because of popular mobilization in communities, because of the housing policy that was expropriating houses of individuals in urban areas, China was forced to introduce a clause to protect private property rights in its own constitution, which was followed by an expropriation bill or law that also speaks about due processes when the state wants to expropriate land of communities or land or houses in urban areas. So it is clear that there is no system in the world which does not recognize the interest of private property rights for you to access finance. It's a reality. It is even practiced in China. I think that is, with regard to support, I think we spoke and I responded. How can we democratize the issue of redistribution in terms of transparency and so forth? But with regard to support, you will remember that when we also came in, we were also put under pressure by what my friend does not like, the international markets, for them to put money into the country. We were forced to withdraw some of the subsidies that the apartheid government was giving to the white farmers. So these are issues that we're also discussing to look into so that we're able to give the kind of subsidies and assistance, particularly for commercial purposes, and also for subsistence farmers in the rural areas. And that the president said he wants it to be done with the rainy season as it starts now in September. So this is an urgent priority that the president has said cabinet must look into and must immediately attend to give support to all farmers in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So if I can just ask a question that wasn't asked to me, I want to answer it. Listen, I think that around this issue of traditional authority, we must be clear that there is a toxic politics because the stakes are really high in certain parts of the country where people have insecure rights and where there are minerals and other resources under the ground. This is very, very conflictual, and I think that the ANC has been quite inconsistent on this issue. The high-level panel was quite damning, but I think that it's met some pushback from within the party. I think that it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. On the issue of the World Bank and its advice, I would agree that the World Bank advised willing buyer, willing seller, and what it said is you should have a market-based land reform program that's willing buyer, willing seller, and at the same time deregulate agriculture and remove the systems of subsidy, single-channel marketing, all of these marketing boards, and other forms of trade protection and support for white commercial agriculture. So we've had a double whammy, where now we have a market-based land reform program, but people coming into the sector are not getting the kinds of support that existed for many decades for white commercial farmers. So that is the challenge, and I think that a sort of a new agrarian reform policy is really what's needed, and we don't have quite clarity on what such an agrarian reform package would look like. So I think that that's a top priority. In response to Mazibuko, you were talking about the dangers that we get, that we place too much emphasis on the role of the courts. And I think that that's a real possibility, that everything just gets hung up in courts on a case-by-case basis, with every single case being challenged. But we do have an Office of Evaluator General, which can set policy, it can set regulations, there can be precedents, and over time there can be greater clarity. So I think that there is potential, but I agree with you that there is a worry. The one very good way in which we can think about land as a public good is we have this Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act. And I think that making that permanent and clarifying and confirming that people who occupy land openly for their own survival have a property right. It's very important that we have that recognition, that we do not regard this as a binary, that either you have private title or you have nothing. We have to provide that kind of recognition of tenure. Crucial. In response to the question about the Msiza case, so this was a fascinating case. It's the first time ever that the Land Claims Court has said we will not pay out market-related compensation, because when you bought this property, you knew that there was a labour tenant claim on this property. You knew that this family had occupied this for generations and that they have legally recognised rights. So no, we will not pay you out some kind of hypothetical market compensation when you don't have effective occupation and use of that land. That's what Tembeka Nkatobi said in the Msiza judgment when he was an acting judge on the Land Claims Court. It's been overturned at the Supreme Court of Appeal. If it were to go through on appeal again to the Constitutional Court, this could be our very best chance to have the first judicial interpretation by the Concord of what constitutes just and equitable, which is meant to balance the interests of the owner, the interests of the claimant, the public interest, our interest, which is not paying out for property which is not being effectively occupied and used. So I think that we need to be clear that expropriation without compensation is now absolutely going to be part of how we move forward. We need to recognize that about half of commercial farmland properties have actually been transacted in the market since 1994. So most of the people that we're talking about were not owners necessarily under apartheid. They might have bought the farms 2 years ago. So we do need to have a spectrum of compensation. I think that prime candidates for expropriation without compensation will likely be, for instance, urban areas where we have absentee landlords in the city buildings, they're not maintaining property, the state is likely to not want to pay any compensation. Informal settlements, farm workers and dwellers who have long historical relationships with land. The ANC in its Ready to Govern document, and again in its December resolution, identifies a range of other categories. But I think that the big question is not about zero compensation. There clearly are cases where it'll be justifiable to pay nothing. The big question is going to be partial compensation. When should people be paid something, but there must be recognition that people have benefited from apartheid? So I think that we're into a new era, and for the first time I think the land issue is actually emerging as an electoral issue. We're in an election cycle, and I think people are starting to ask questions about the land issue and asking the ruling party exactly what it's offering. And my argument is that we should not only ask it whether it's offering a constitutional amendment, is it offering a coherent policy framework about in whose interests land will be expropriated? And what is our alternative agrarian reform policy? Because I think that that is not yet clear. Thank you.